Before I tell you what we were trying to do, I want to talk about stories and why they're so important, and why researchers in particular, people like me, who have been stupidly thinking for a long time that all I have to do is do the research and then put it out there, and if you like, the facts will speak for themselves. And we have learned over the last few years in really, really fantastically serious ways that actually the people who rule the world these days are the people who tell the best stories. They're not the right stories in my view, they're not even the most moral stories, but they are compelling stories. And I was reminded of this very vividly the other night. I don't know if anybody, and this is relevant, did anybody watch Hillary Clinton on the Channel 4 News? And her story is, she was robbed of the election by the Russians and by Comey. That's what she seemed to be saying. She seemed to be saying, and quite understandably, she was saying, you know, I was ahead, and then there were these crucial interventions by Assange and WikiLeaks and by Comey putting out the emails. What, in my view, because I have been reading massively for ages now about stories and thinking about how you affect change and how you engage people emotionally and morally to change the world, I think what she didn't engage with, for all sorts of really important reasons, is she didn't engage with the fact that actually Donald Trump told, in essence, a better story. Not a better story for the world, not a better story for the US, but as we'll see, he told the perfect political story. And she wasn't able to articulate a strong enough, morally convincingly story, for reasons we'll talk about in a minute. And there's a great new book out by George Monbiot, writes in The Guardian, which is about, he talks about how stories are the means by which we navigate the world. We tell stories about ourselves, where we've come from, how we understand the world, how we've got to where we are. You know, anyone who watches X Factor knows that stories are the lifeblood of what's going on and the way we make sense of our lives. But we also make sense of the world through stories. That's good, that's bad, that's a good local authority, he's a good manager, she's not, whatever. Stories are the way that we interpret complex and contradictory signals, and we order them into, they're good people over there and they're bad people. In fact, human beings, tragically, have a real tendency towards what's called groupish righteousness, towards thinking, that's my tribe, I believe in that, I believe in those people, Jeremy Corbyn is my man, and those people over there are bad people. Actually, one of the problems with those stories is we assume that we have all the moral rights on our side and that those people over there haven't got any morality, which is rarely the case. It mightn't be our morality, but it is a morality. All compelling stories tend to have a plot, feature victims and villains, have a moral, and appeal to particular values. So Donald Trump, whether we like it or not, had a very good political story. There were victims, the poor downtrodden white Americans, particularly American men. There were villains, the Mexicans and the immigrants. There was a plot. I will take back control, I will build a wall. It appealed to particular values around independence, around taking charge, around, like, we can take back America. America had a great story. America was great, and it has fallen down. It's highly racially coded, this story, but it was a very effective story. Because Hillary Clinton was completely compromised by her engagement with a whole range of things that have led to lots of people being disenfranchised, all she could do was rely on evidence and experts. Evidence and experts in a post-truth world have a very, very tricky status. People like me, the evidence doesn't speak for itself anymore, as we found out in the Brexit. We have to tell a story about the evidence. Crucially, so one of the things George Monbiot argues is that it is not enough to critique. So people like me who have gone around for a long time saying, I don't like the way the child protection system works, it's not enough. It's not even enough for me to give you the evidence today to say this is not why it works well, and I will be giving you evidence today to suggest that it doesn't work well, in my view. If you want to change things, you have to develop and tell an alternative story. And that story must be rooted in evidence. I'm not talking about kind of just anything goes. It must be rooted in the evidence that can be open to debate and dialogue, and it must appeal to alternative values. There is a lot of research that says that as human beings, in all cultures, there are at least about 80 core values that are distributed differently. So if you go to Sweden, values around solidarity, around supporting each other, around interdependence are more likely to be entrenched than if you go to America, which has very strong values around individualism, around looking after yourself, looking after your family. But values locally can shift and change. Values aren't fixed. There is a lot of evidence to suggest that actually by reading something, something say about like what's happening to a child in India, actually, if you're reading something like that, you're more likely to go and do something that's a compassionate activity afterwards than, say, reading something that's about killing people. Do you know, our values can shift and change. But it is important that people like me who want to change things, when I'm telling you I think there is something wrong with what's going on in our system, that I'm actually saying there is another story, and the story could be rooted in different kinds of values. So, for example, one of my values is that we are all interdependent, and that we shouldn't be outsourcing the task of protecting children to social workers, that we should be, as communities, and as societies, taking responsibility for how children are protected. So let's start with the dominant stories, and let's see how our research, which was about deprivation, how our research unsettles and questions the dominant stories, and how we might be able to start telling new stories. So let's look at story one. Story one comes from the 1960s, from a very different era. Kemp found battered babies who he argued were beaten by poor parents, emotionally deprived parents who lacked empathic mothering in their own lives. It wasn't that they were poor, it wasn't that they had awful housing, it wasn't about attachment issues, particularly even at that point. He was talking about a kind of deep-rooted psychological unmet need. And he was in a period of Keynesianism, which is where people thought the welfare state looked after most people. We had housing for everybody, we had a universal education, we had an NHS, we had income if you lost your job, you had a benefit system. So everyone really was being taken care of, but there were some people who just couldn't manage. They were on the margins of society, and there were people who were just fairly tragic and had very difficult childhoods. Very compassionate story, actually, rooted in care for these needy parents. And that story, in its essentials, has stayed the same, in the sense, not stayed the same, but its essentials are that child abuse is about something that happens in families, and it's something that's done by or not done by parents. Child abuse isn't about how safe our streets are, how safe our buildings are, whether there's lead in our water. That's not the case, although New Labour tried to bring more of a safeguarding approach to it. Child abuse, currently particularly, is about what parents are doing or not doing in their families. It has morphed alarmingly, though, from a compassionate project towards parents, towards one that stresses the risks that parents pose to their children and their individual responsibility for whether their children have enough to eat, whether their children are going to school or not. There's a really important, in the context of the project I'm going to tell you about today, poverty, there is a real clear view that actually it is offensive to poor people to say that abuse is linked. Most poor people do not abuse their children, and poverty doesn't cause abuse and neglect, but it does impact upon parenting because of the stress it causes. There is often a really big confusion between direct and what's called systemic causation. There are very few things in the world that are subject to direct causation. If I say to a child, please don't put your hand on the fire because you'll burn it, that is direct causation. And most babies and children learn very quickly about direct causation, either because they do put their hand on the guard or they learn it through their parents. But most of the time, the hurricane we've just had, most of the things that happen, we can't just say it had one cause. Most social issues have multiple causes. I used to smoke. I really hope. There is a lot of evidence that smoking causes lung cancer. But actually, not all people who smoke get lung cancer. I really hope I'm going to be one of the ones who doesn't get lung cancer. There are very few things that are absolutely, clearly, directly caused. So when people say to me, poverty doesn't cause child abuse, actually, they're operating with a different ledger. They're operating on the ledger of direct causation. And actually, sometimes it may be a direct cause when literally people don't have enough to eat, and we're approaching that situation in this country now. But it is often a very clear indirect contributor. So, but the dominant story at the minute is you shouldn't talk about poverty in this way. The other thing is that, particularly at the moment, child protection, the protection of children, and their welfare in the broadest sense, the links are recognised, but they're poorly understood and relatively underexplored. And I will talk about how that is a real problem in England at the minute, because I'm going to talk about how this story has really, really changed in the last 5 years in England. And then we have early time-limited interventions are the best things to do to mitigate against brain damage, and also obviously family support help. But really, that story, I will argue, it's crude, but it's kind of telling. It appeals to kind of certain kinds of values, the importance of individual responsibility of parents looking after children. It appeals to the task of social workers going in there to save children, to rescue children, to assess risk, to make sure the children are safe. And it appeals to the really strong belief that we shouldn't make excuses for bad behaviour, that we should take responsibility for bad behaviour, and that we shouldn't be. And this has become really, really central to the current iteration of this story. So, for someone like me who is interested in stories, this is the perfect quote. This is from Michael Gove in 2012-13, and it was a really important speech. It was a speech where he was announcing a whole range of new initiatives in relation to child protection and in relation to social work, and it was loads of the things that have happened since around how we've changed education for social workers, how we've innovation programs, a lot of the emphasis on practice methodologies, the accreditation, all these things came from this whole period. But in this story, before the Conservatives got into power in 2000, I know they got in a coalition, but before they got into power in 2009, 2010, actually they had been working with many people like Ali Munro and people around the whole way in which New Labour had developed this command and control state. As audit culture, the Tories lodged a very good critique of it, which linked with their critique about small state. And one of the things they made common cause with liberating social workers from bureaucracy. And so when they got into power then, they couldn't return to an old narrative of blaming social workers for anything. What they did, very cleverly there, remember every story has to have a victim and a villain. The villain there is social work educators. Social work educators have been encouraging idealistic young students to excuse the bad behaviour of parents, to say to them, there, you can't help abusing your child because you're poor, because you live in an unequal society. And what Michael Gove says is, this is really, really pernicious story. Profoundly irresponsible. And he articulated a social justice mission which was about rescuing children from these irresponsible people, and social workers being given the right practice tools and the right methodologies, and crucially also through using adoption to start a new story.